Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and about what's next. It's a show that wants to ask questions, peel back the layers of our average everyday experience, and go beyond scratching the surface. We interview amazing people with incredible ideas and stories who have done wild, weird, and wonderful things. Remember that imagination shared creates collaboration, and collaboration creates community, and community inspires social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. My guest today is Terry LeBlanc. He's the founder and director of an organization called NAIITS. We're going to put a link to that on the website. You'll hear more about it in the interview. We talk about burnt oatmeal today, strangely enough, and advanced educations for First Nations, Inuit and Métis folk. We talk about faith and about education and about capacity building and the residential school problem in Canada here and what it means to live with compound world views. I mean, we get into a whole lot here, and clearly we're going to have a part two with Terry at some point down the road. We talk a lot about ethics and about morality and about creation and the reconciliation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in Canada as well. And so listen in. I think you're going to learn a ton. You're going to learn a lot more about this organization that Terry works with and some of the great work that they're doing. One last thing that we talk about, and that is the relational component to pretty much everything we do. And it almost sounds trite and almost sounds cliche, but listen, buckle up, listen in. DavidPeckLive.com, Rabble.ca for more face-to-face interviews, and thanks for joining us again today. Well, welcome to Face to Face. We're joined by another very special guest today, as usual, because I only invite special guests onto this show. Dr. Terry LeBlanc.
Yeah, just Terry's fine.
Is Terry fine? Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you ever get introduced as a doctor and kind of get embarrassed about that? Or?
Well, it's not an embarrassment. It's part of the excursion that we've been on in the Indigenous world is certainly to pursue advanced education. I mean, Blair Stonechild's book, Education is the New Buffalo, sort of popularizes the idea that to a certain extent we have to find our way into the educational world to see how it is that as Indigenous peoples in a contemporary environment we engage our traditional values, philosophies, ideologies in some kind of meaningful way, and part of that has been pursuing education. So having said that, we're trying not to sort of embrace the ivory tower mentality of that, where I've climbed my way to the top, so you have to call me doctor, but rather see it more in many respects, more as a contemporary sense of repositories of certain amount of learning and wisdom that we've entered into that others have held before us, and now we're simply the stewards of that. So it just trying to, I mean, not trying to be farcical about it, just trying to keep some humility in the whole package. You know,
you don't have to call me doctor, but I would appreciate sir.
Somebody calls me sir, I always say, no, that was my dad's name.
That's funny.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit, Terry, about what you do. I mean, tell me a little bit about your past, but you're a director of an organization called NAIITS. You're working on First Nations issues. I mean, I think I'd call you an advocate or an activist. I mean, you before the tape was running, the recorder was running, you had a great line about burnt oatmeal. I hope you share it. But tell me, you write, you speak. That's how you and I first met some, I don't know, 11 years ago or something.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Mm-hmm. And we've crossed paths from time to time. So yeah, tell me a little bit about your path over the last few years.
Well, in the last 20 years, a number of us, myself and a number of First Nations, Métis, Inuit people from within the North American context began this journey to create, I'll call it an organization that would allow us to explore and to write and to think theologically, missiologically, biblically, sociologically, anthropologically, and all of those things within a frame of reference that is Indigenous, but also has some connectedness to not only our own traditions, but the traditions of faith that we have individually and collectively embraced within a broader paradigm of what I would say is the Christian community. And of course, if you're familiar with the residential schools era, you know that Christianity and church were used as clubs and weapons. And so the message of Jesus became weaponized in some respects to subdue us and to seek to assimilate us and so forth. So we're trying to undo some of that, at the same time as hanging on to the centrality of the message of Jesus in our own situations, in our own lives, that allow us the liberty to explore what that means from within our own sociocultural and spiritual contexts. So I've been a part of this group of people who've been pursuing this for 20 years. Formally, NAIITS has existed for 16 years. It's originally known as the North American Institute for Indigenous Theological Studies now, because we do more than theological studies. We do investigations into community capacity building, community development, and a whole range of other things. We simply refer to it as NAIITS, an Indigenous Learning Community. So a majority of my effort is focused there. I do a lot of teaching and writing, research around topics of concern to us. We publish an annual journal, host an annual symposium. This year it's at Tyndale University College and Seminary, June 2nd to 4th, focusing on education this year again. We haven't done that for a long time, looking at what does it mean to be educated as a Native person, as an Indigenous man or woman. And then we also focus on community capacity building, community development initiatives that facilitate Indigenous peoples and communities toward health and well-being, dealing with the aftermath of residential schools, dealing with the inadequate levels of funding in communities to care for the needs of populations, dealing with youth and their need for hope. So we have a variety of program structures and emphases dealing with those under the banner of Indigenous Pathways.
So you're pretty busy.
Yeah, I keep out of mischief.
So isn't Christianity a white man's religion? I mean, what do you do with that?
Well, it is.
You know, I love what you said about it being weaponized. The message of Jesus was weaponized. That's an awesome line. There should be T-shirts and bumper stickers. Because it really reduces it to what I think happened in so many places around the world.
Yeah.
So I find it a bit of a contradiction in a way that you're this First Nations guy who was won over by the white man's religion.
Well,
is that a fair assessment?
Well, I mean, it's a fair frame.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, good.
Maybe not a fair conclusion,
right,
but
good.
A fair frame.
Good.
I think that a number of us met with Paul Martin, former Prime Minister Paul Martin, years ago, and maybe this is a good way to answer your question. And so there were 12 of us, First Nations folks in the room, and we were going to have an hour and a half or two with Paul Martin. And
the only reason I'm a big fan of Paul Martin is I have this image of him meeting Bono way back when, because Bono was challenging him on the 0.7%.
Yeah,
Do you remember that?
Yeah, I remember that very well.
I remember I think I was at a concert, U2 concert, and Bono's like singing Paul Martin's praises.
Well, you know, I've worked with Paul Martin for a space of time on a committee for Indigenous education over the last years, and I've always had a respect for Paul.
And he was wearing his U2 shirt at that?
Oh, no, he wasn't. No, I'm afraid not. No, he was the chairman of the board dressed.
Okay,
So at any rate, as we're meeting with, getting prepared for the meeting with Paul in the West Block, and sorting out how we might want to convey some of our concerns and talk about some of the issues and so forth, wondered what kind of common ground we would have in terms of our thinking and so forth. So Paul came in and with one of his aides and sat down and said, "Now, before we begin, I have one comment to make and a question to ask." He said, my comment would be this. He said, "I believe we're assembled here today, you First Nations folks and myself, and there's a common foundation of faith between us." And he said, "I am a practicing Catholic. And he really wanted to emphasize that he was engaged in his Catholic Christian faith. And so that was great to hear. Then he made this interesting statement, asked this interesting question. He said, I just have a question, and that is, given all that we have done to you people, why would you want to be Christian? Mm. And before we could say a word, the youngest member of our team, a bit impetuous, spouted off, it's because of Jesus. And in a very real sense, that's what it is. Mm. So Christianity and church have not been good and helpful many times. The institutional expressions, the transactional presentations, the desire to get us, quote, saved, but pay little, if any, attention to our lives other than to be exploited, other than to be assimilated, other than to be, in many respects, abused. But it was Christianity and church, not the teachings of Jesus. So there's a difference between the person, work, life, teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus and an engagement with the story of Scripture than there is than with the sort of institutional presentation of that, if I can. And it's that we've engaged with. And I mean, I'm a Mi'kmaq person with Acadian blood coursing through my veins. And so I come from both of those cultures ultimately, and although we're a Mi'kmaq family. The first baptism among my people was June 24th, 1610. An ancestor who, together with 21 members of his extended family, was baptized by Jesse Flachet.
So cool that you know that, actually. That's
awesome. Well, I mean, it's part of sort of the way we are is to know our history. I'm here because of my history, not because of my future. Yeah. So that's the tradition from which I come. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's 405 years ago, 406 years ago this year. It's the tradition from which I come. So when people tell me they're a traditional person, I say, so am I. The tradition from which I come is Christianity expressed in a Mi'kmaq way. And I emphasize in a Mi'kmaq way. Mi'kmaq Christianity, Mi'kmaq Catholic Christianity looks very different. And while I don't engage in the Catholic framework of expression of my following of Jesus, I engage differently. I nonetheless engage in Christian faith as a tradition of our people and not something to be set aside lightly. The community of men and women that I associate with may not have exactly that same traditional trajectory, but they experience Jesus' teachings in the same way. So again, it's about the person, work, life, teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus, not about Christianity and the way the church has dealt with that, or individuals for that matter.
Do you lose people sort of on both sides of the fence? Sorry for the polarization, because I don't buy into that idea, and I know you don't either, but...
Yeah, binaries are always a problem.
They really are, right? On so many levels. So they're just anti-relational.
Yeah.
But do you lose a certain First Nations group, and do you lose a certain sort of Christian / Catholic / evangelical group because you're kind of dancing in every world in a sense, right? Because I want to talk about God in a second, or a creator, and you call yourself a traditional person. I want to hear a little bit more about that because I'm really interested.
Well, you lose people in part because they don't give you the opportunity to talk about not just what you mean, but what you experience and why. So they tend to have a superficial assessment, and as a consequence, a superficial judgment that they pass. And on, and it is a continuum. It's not a binary necessarily, even in terms of its continuum. Probably has more circularity to it than anything. People have a tendency to sort of move around issues, looking at them for a variety of sides, and on any given occasion they may be over there in the circle, and on another occasion over here in the circle, looking into the center of this particular issue or situation or what have you. So they tend not to be binaries, but they tend to be these continuums that are more circular, I think. If that's how I describe them. But it's because, on the one hand, there's this historic call. You have to either be Christian or Indian. You can't be an Indian Christian kind of thing. And on the other side of the equation is you have to be a traditional person in terms of your experience. And so I say to the people who say you can't be an Indian Christian or Christian Indian, you have to choose one way or the other. I say, well, do you have to choose to be non-Caucasian when you come to faith in Christ, or when you experience conversion, whatever that looked like or might be? Do you have to set aside all of your culture and your realities? What are the things that you leave behind in your culture, in your socio-cultural milieu? And typically, of course, of somebody who's of a Euro-Canadian or Euro-American descent, the answer is a big fat goose egg, nothing. They bring their economic system, they bring their dress, they bring their musical preferences, they bring the whole darn thing. They leave behind rather the morality kinds of things as they see them. They might not smoke, drink, dance, or chew, or go with girls who do, but apart from that, they bring everything. So I say, well, why do we have to leave everything behind? What's the reasoning behind that? And it seems quite hypocritical that we would have to do that. On the other side of the equation are our traditional folks, and so I meet people all the time who say, no, I'm a traditional. I practice the spirituality of my forebears, of my ancestors, and so on. So I'm full on traditional, and then they get in their car and drive away.
Right.
And I say, well, just come on, don't be so foolish.
Right.
We live in this bicultural, tricultural, multicultural, and I don't mean the Canadian multicultural sort of reality. We live in compound worldviews. Our worldviews are not unicultural. They are not in any way, shape, or form today. It'd be difficult to find an Indigenous person in North America whose worldview is, strictly speaking, traditional cultural. They engage in the contemporary environment, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of convenience, sometimes as a means of getting along to go along. These purists on both extremes are both in awkward positions, and I find
they're kind of lying to themselves in a way, aren't they? I mean, if we really are kind of circular in a sense and compounded in our worldview, the whole notion of polarization or the up-down positive-negative approach really isn't the way we operate.
Well, no. And I mean, if you're scientists, you say the Heisenberg principle of uncertainty makes us clearly aware that both and is a more appropriate way of thinking of things than the either or. So we're both here and there, sometimes at different times, sometimes simultaneously. And that's a mystery that I think we should be comfortable with. When we're talking about God or about the Creator, this is my segue into where you wanted to go.
Thank you.
Did you like that?
I did. Very, very impressive.
So when
we
we're
don't
talking,
even need to edit that. It's cool.
Yeah, when we're talking about God or about the Creator of all things, we're talking about someone who lives in the both and, who is the author of the both and, who expresses the reality of I am both fully present in human form in the person of Jesus, but fully present in an other form which you can't begin to comprehend. I am both the creator and at a point in time I have become the created. It's this profound mystery. The early church fathers and mothers struggled to comprehend, and we still do. It's a mystery. And this is something we have to be prepared to embrace, to understand, is that no matter how articulate we are about the faith perspectives we have, or about our trite little doctrinal statements, or what have you, that we only, as well as the Apostle Paul would say, we only see in this glass very, very dimly. There's this huge mystery that extends behind the glass that we can only begin to hint at.
Would there be many First Nations folk in Canada, in the West, wherever, that you would qualify as atheists? Or would most First Nations folk land on some kind of a creator, some kind of a spiritual world out there somewhere?
Yeah. Well, I couldn't of a certainty say that they don't exist. I can say that I've yet to meet any, and I've yet to meet anybody who has. So our usual...
It's pretty remarkable, really.
Well, sure it is. I mean, this is an interesting thing for people of an evangelical Christian context who who are interested in seeing people experience a personal faith in Christ, et cetera, and they're involved in evangelism and so forth, oftentimes with Euro-Canadians, Euro-North Americans, and so forth. These days, they have to start by convincing them that God exists, and typically that's not an issue for our folks. There's this truism. I'm a created being, therefore there's a creator. What I see around me was created, therefore someone created it. So there's these truisms, and I don't mean to be trite and unscientific about it. We're less concerned about the method of the creation or the means of the creation or the frame of the creation or otherwise, but somehow this has come together. When I get in my car and drive away, I know someone made the thing. Mm-hmm. And we extend that same principle reality.
The argument from design is a given, by the sound of it, in a sense.
Well, for us it is. It's astounding to us to think that somehow, when we look in the environment around us, that these patterns and symmetries that are so obvious have come about simply by chance process. And again, we're not overly anxious about length of time and dating and a whole range of other things. That isn't the issue. It's just that there is some intentionality that you can observe. It leads us to understanding the principal attribute of the author of it all as creator, and we as creation.
What I love is you guys start relationally, right? You presuppose. Forget about the argument for design. Forget about the philosophical problems or Aristotle's unmoved mover or whatever you want to call it. But you're starting with relationship, which is marvelous.
Yes.
And
well,
I think most of us do. We just don't know it.
Perhaps. I think that the post-Enlightenment church really began to put more and more of its eggs in the cognitive basket.
Right.
And rationalism became so prevalent that to step back into an intuitive embrace of reality, of spiritual things and so forth became difficult for them. And even when they did, they tended to still be very cognitive. So if you look at the Ignatian spirituality, and this is no disrespect to it by any means or stretch, I think it's been very helpful to many people, but if you look at Ignatian spirituality, there's still a significant cognitive frame around it, still a significant rationalist frame around it. And because the Jesuits were the publishers of the Journal of the Enlightenment, in the 1700s, I think there's a pretty good reason why the projected Jesuit spirituality post Ignatius of Loyola became what it became. So we tend to back up into relationship, which is why, as I've been teaching my students and others when I get the opportunity, and I'll someday perhaps even write it in a book, I think that the West has gotten itself into a significant amount of trouble, irrespective of the tradition, Catholic, Protestant, mainline, Protestant, evangelical, gotten itself into a significant amount of trouble in defining sin in terms of moral, legal issues. Mm-hmm. So the moral, legal framework, the Augustinian framework, has been unhelpful, in fact, very destructive, partly because we become self-hypocritical in it by defining certain kinds of sin. Now, of course, in the Catholic tradition, cardinal, mortal, and venial gradations of sin became very, very common at a period in the church, and to some still are. The Protestant church hasn't done it quite the same way, but we treat some sins differently than others.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And yet in the biblical narrative, we don't find that that's the case. We find sin is sin is sin is sin.
Yeah. And forget about Christians too, or religious folk. Don't most of us end up in this spiral into this simple moralistic kind of framework? He's bad, she's good, etc.
And it isn't that morality is not important, or ethics are not important. But here we talk ethics not in terms of philosophical ethics, but actual ethics, which is about behavior. Because ethics is about behavior. The ethic of, ethics isn't some sort of philosophical space that we put our heads into to imagine or to wonder, although people do that, to be sure. Ethicists do. But we're really asking questions about our behavior. And so there's a moral edge to it, to be sure. But when we talk about sin, and if you want to do it from a biblical theological frame, as an Indigenous person, I look at it and I say in the first 2 chapters of the book of Genesis, which is as the narrative unfolds, you see this wonderful creation, the panoply of all of creation living in some kind of harmonious balance, interconnected, interrelated, interdependent. There's some descriptors of that, albeit brief. And then in the 3rd chapter, the wheels fall off, not because of a moral legal issue, but because our first parents in the narrative choose to break the covenant of harmony and of relationship. And there in the chapter of Genesis, 3rd chapter of Genesis, we find a description of layers of relationship that have now been subjected to, as Paul would later say, futility. So the relationship between human beings and God and other spiritual powers, and I emphasize other spiritual powers, is devastated. So it's not just a vertical relationship with God, but there are other spiritual realities that are part of the created order that we've fallen into disharmony with. Some things that we strive to achieve that we ought not to, and some things that we should that we don't do. And so there's this breaking of relationship between ourselves, our Creator, and other spiritual powers. Then, of course, there's the breach of relationship between human beings, as expressed in the male and the female, but not limited to them. You find, for example, in the breach of relationship, a difference in perspective emerges really quickly. God comes to the man and says, "What's this you've done? Where were you? I was looking for you. We were going to have our daily walk, and I couldn't find you. Well, I was naked. Who told you that? Well, the woman you gave me." Mm-hmm. So we're fixated on the woman, but we fail to recognize that he's blaming God. Yeah. The woman you gave me.
Yeah.
So
there's a whole other kind of willful intention there, right? It's a really interesting distinction from a narrative perspective of what it actually means to us.
Absolutely. So then God goes over and says to our first mother, "What the heck did you do?" Yeah. "Well, the serpent beguiled me and I ate." Yeah. Who's she blaming? Who made the serpent? How did this all come about? So it's perhaps some would say more of a tangential blame of God, but it's still very real. And don't we do that still today? Mm-hmm. Whenever something happens we don't like, we blame God, and yet we resent that he might even remotely treat us like robots in our behavior.
So deeply ironic that, I love your phrase about how the breaking of the covenant and the relationship and sort of this is part of the narrative of Genesis. And I mean, let's fast forward almost, 1900 years to the troubles we've had here in Canada. Because I'd love to shift gears a little bit and say the anti-relational approach that we took towards First Nations communities, mm-hmm. residential schools, the weaponization of religion or of Christianity in this particular case, and the damage it's done. I'd love for you to tell me a little bit more about that, Terry, in a sense of, I want the answers.
Yeah.
Right? I want the answers.
Well, then we better stop and go find somebody who
That's
has.
right. Yes. Or book another meeting. Yeah.
No, won't be here.
Yeah, that's right. Maybe we need to call Bono.
Yeah, maybe we should. Yeah, that'd be good. He spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington the year after we did.
Oh, is that right? Oh, nice.
So maybe he was one up from us or something.
Everything comes back to you two for me.
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying.
Okay.
Yeah. With or without you. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I have a certain affinity for that.
Oh, good.
But just to finish, because I think it leads into where you want to go. So the relational breach, God and spiritual powers and humanity, human beings with one another, not just male and female, but humans with one another, and then human beings and the rest of creation. Right? That's the third relational breach. And people who experience themselves as part of creation, which quite frankly Christians tend not to do. When you talk to Christian people, they put creation out there somewhere, and they've stepped back from it as if there's something else. And I say to my students, if you're not part of creation, then what the heck are you? Mm-hmm. So if we see ourselves integrated, interrelated, interdependent, it's a different frame. So that relational breach has taken place there in that third chapter of Genesis, and we see that being pushed out, and there's this trajectory towards its continued the continued decay of these relationships and efforts of God to provide a framework within which these can begin to be managed in the law and so on in the biblical narrative. And you certainly see them in other cultures, where there are certain mores and morals and values and standards and practices that come into existence in other cultures that are not biblical cultures, not biblically literate cultures, prior to the Europeanization of much of the world, who also have these mores, these values, these standards, these ideas about right behavior that are seeking to restore broken relationship and maintain the balance of good relationship, which is really what a lot of it is about. So if we change the definition of sin from its moral legal, which really isn't a very good biblical frame anyway, to understanding the relationships that are severed, we actually get to where you're wanting to go, which is to talk about why First Nations people were treated the way they were. So they were treated the way they were, A, because they were considered uncivilized, because they didn't possess in the European mindset a level of technological sophistication that allowed for them to be described as civilized, whether that was a text-driven culture, although even cultures that were text-driven were considered uncivilized, whether that was the technologies of things like gunpowder or ships sailing or a particular way of organizing societies around hierarchical authorities and so forth. All of those things weren't in their minds present, therefore we were uncivilized. So there's that. There's the idea that our behavior did not conform to the behavior that the Europeans thought important. And by that I don't mean it was evil or immoral. In fact, if you read the writings of the earliest missionaries, the Jesuits, the Recollets, the Franciscans, etc., whether here or elsewhere, they will extol the virtues. They don't give themselves to the lust after things and possessions and material goods. They don't kill people to get their stuff, generally speaking, although I'm sure there were those circumstances where it happened. So there are a variety of things that you can find written by the very missionaries who were here saying we were uncivilized. That lead you to a different conclusion if you bother to step back from the frame of reference that they've already offered you. So we didn't fit. Point number one, uncivilized. Point two, a morality in their minds that was not the same as theirs, a behavior that was not the same as theirs, goals and objectives and values that weren't the same as theirs. And then lastly, but most significantly, although there is the myth of migration to North America and elsewhere for religious freedom, that was really quite secondary to the real issue for migration, and that was to acquire wealth. So the papal bulls that assigned to the king and queen, respectively, of Spain and Portugal, dividing the world into Portuguese territory and Spanish territory, and then the ones that followed subsequently with France, and then Britain's engagement in Belgium and Holland and so forth. All of them were about wealth. The migrations were about acquiring wealth. To be sure, Europe was overpopulated for what it could support, so there was a need to get people out and all of those kinds of things, but it really was about substantial wealth. So the way to deal with us is to Christianize us and civilize us and get us out of the way so that the land becomes available. And that's still the attitude that prevails today.
Greed, or greed over God.
That's still the attitude that prevails today when you talk about First Nations people blocking, disagreeing with the development of natural resource today that will pollute the waters, that will force them off lands that they've lived on for thousands of years and all of that. The folks down south, in particular south, who want that development to happen, want to push people yet again off their land so development can proceed because it's about wealth. It's about money. It's about financial security. The curious thing, this is a bit of an aside. I just heard a study about, since the U.S. election is in full blossom in the campaign, I just heard an interesting study about republicanism and evangelicalism and the correlation between the two in the U.S. And most people think that it's about the religious values of Republicans, so that the Republican candidates want to appeal to this large voting bloc of evangelicals, conservative, big E evangelicals in the U.S. But the study indicates that the concern that the big E evangelical has less to do, significantly less to do, with the religious values than it does with the financial values.
Wild.
Yes.
Wow.
So those values that drove European colonization and the subjugation and attempted assimilation of first peoples in various lands are still active today.
So can we blame the raving free market capitalists? Is that what we're saying here? And I mean, tongue-in-cheek, right? I'm kind of joking, but at the same time, I mean, it's this. Is it an individual pursuit of wealth and gain and disregard for the other?
Well,
I mean,
it certainly is individualism as a part of it. I mean, when you look at the father of modern economics, Adam Smith, and his articulation of the principles of the free market, his clearly articulated ideology is that each individual should pursue their own self-interests to the best of their ability. For in doing so, they create the market economy and the potential for trickle down, not a trickle down to the impoverished, but a trickle down so that the market continues to grow. So here's an interesting thing. We prosecuted Bernie Madoff because of the big Ponzi scheme that Bernie perpetrated. But ask yourself the question, when we're marketed to with greater and greater and greater individualism in the marketing approach, so they market to David Peck, not to Terry LeBlanc, when they pop up on your Facebook, and Mark Zuckerberg is earning lots of money on the advertising, not on the fact that you've got 5,332 friends. So it increasingly individualizes, and you have to get more and more people in at the bottom so that fewer and fewer can benefit at the top, the 1 in 99. If that's not a Ponzi scheme, I don't know what it is, right? Because the effort is to market to us so that we consume more. By consuming more, we need more production. More production means more people. More people mean higher profits. And if that's not a Ponzi scheme, I'm not sure what is. That's free market economy.
We have to wrap it up in a few minutes, and I would love to talk a little bit about reconciliation, the residential school situation, and maybe even, I don't know, a challenge to my listenership and to me personally. You know, what is it that average Canadians can do, you know, over and above donating to organizations, over and above bringing up this as a conversation and staying informed? I mean, clearly the residential school situation right now is becoming more and more of an issue for the Trudeau government. Seems like they're taking it on in a respectful way. I hope they are. I don't know how you feel about that. I know that. Anyway, so can you give us your insight there?
Well, I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is the most recent of a series of commissions that have consistently brought forward to the Canadian public the treatment of First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples in Canada that has been unjust. The TRC brought to our attention the residential schools era, the survivors' stories, the stories of pain and suffering, the stories of people taken from their families and spirited away to places at a distance where they were indoctrinated with, as one of my staff would say, indoctrinated with another people's language, culture, and history as if their own didn't exist.
That's good.
And even if there were no cases of sexual abuse, physical abuse, or other kinds of abuse, the fact that one people group thought they had the right to take our children from us and take them at a distance from us, prevent us from seeing them and parenting them and being their families for 16 years of their life in some cases, 12 for many, 10 for others, is itself obscene.
It's obscene.
Absolutely
it's
obscene.
Utterly outrageous. You know, I watch some of these older films on whatever they might be historically, and you kind of go, how did anyone ever think that was a good idea?
Yeah.
I just don't get it.
So the TRC published 94 recommendations and a narrative surrounding those recommendations. And what people can do who are listening to this is to pick up a copy of the recommendations and the report of the TRC and become familiar with it.
Nice.
And as they read it, ask themselves the question, what do I personally need to do for any of these to implement them? What do I need to do with the groups of people that I associate with or the organizations I'm involved in to bring them to the fore? How can I begin to implement the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report? There are 94. The church particularly named in number 57 through 63, and although in other places as well, but those 57 through 63, what do you do about that? Individually, in your congregation, in your community? How do you implement those recommendations? How do you engage with First Peoples to understand the context in which those recommendations have been issued? Those are things that are very pragmatic, very practical things that can be done. And to the extent that people will engage them with seriousness and educate themselves about the residential schools through the report and the recommendations, they will be prepared to ensure that it doesn't happen again.
You have a meeting coming up with, I believe, Jesse James. So
Yes. This Indian boy is going to go meet with Jesse James.
Right. Yes. So we need to wrap it up, and we're going to have to do part 2. But are you hopeful?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm very hopeful. And I'm hopeful for a very particular reason. When the apology was issued in 2008, I was gathered with a number of my colleagues, and we watched the apology unfold. And that day in the House of Commons, the Canadian government minted a new coin. And the coin had imprinted on the one side these words, "We were wrong." And the Prime Minister then
getting a shiver.
Said, "We failed in a whole range of ways. We were wrong." Our folks have picked up the coin and turned it over, and they've found inscribed on the other side these words, "We were right. We were right to resist. We were right to seek to preserve our languages and culture. We were right to fight for our rights under treaty. We were right to pursue our unique status in the Canadian Constitution Act of 1982. We were right to do that." And that's going to bring a great deal of freedom to our people, a release to our people going forward that will enable them to see a brighter future. So I'm very hopeful. I'm also very hopeful because for the first time, any commission since I've been alive that has addressed the issues of the Aboriginal community in Canada, for the very first time, I hear people taking the TRC seriously and the recommendations seriously.
That's good.
So I'm very hopeful.
Your website, tell us about how to get there.
You could go to www.indigenouspathways.com, and there you would be able to be taken to all 3 of the program frameworks that we work within, and we'd be happy. We're doing our annual symposium focusing on Indigenous education here at Tyndale University College and Seminary on Bayview, June 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. People are welcome to come. There's a registration fee. We've got to make a few bucks to pay for it.
Rich beyond your wildest dreams.
Unfortunately, but I think it would be an eye-opener for people to come and engage with us and see what we're all about.
We'll talk about that on the site. We'll stick it in the bio, and we'll tweet about it as well for whatever that's worth.
Good.
But, Terry LeBlanc with us today, Director of NAIITS, author, teacher, and doctor, actually. Dr. Terry LeBlanc. Thanks for
God will get you for that,
David.
David.
That's right, yes. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, David.